One university costs $26,000 a year. Another costs $85,000. Madison gets into both, and she chooses the $85,000 school because it's actually cheaper. Not cheaper after some negotiation, not cheaper by mistake. Cheaper because the $85,000 number printed on that letter was never really meant to be the number she'd pay. That one strange fact is about to reveal something much bigger about how universities actually make their money. Most people assume college is expensive because education itself is expensive to deliver. Professors, buildings, labs, research. Costs go up, so prices go up. Simple supply and demand. But if that were the whole story, tuition would track enrollment and staffing costs fairly closely. Instead, since 1980, published tuition and fees in the US have risen by roughly 1,200%, while overall consumer prices over that same stretch rose by around 230%. Whatever is driving that gap, it isn't simply the rising cost of chalk and classrooms. So, Madison opens her financial aid portal to find out where her number actually came from. Here's the first thing she learns. At most private universities, the sticker price basically isn't the real price. It's closer to a list price that almost nobody pays in full. Most families apply for aid, and schools build their sticker price high enough to still collect full tuition from the few who don't, while quietly discounting almost everyone else based on what the school calculates they can afford. At the average private non-profit college, first-year students receive a discount of over 50% off the sticker price. Roughly 9 in 10 of them get some kind of institutional grant. This isn't quite the same as an airline charging two people different fares for the same seat. It runs through financial aid, need-based grants, and merit scholarships instead of a single dial labelled price. But the effect lands in a similar place. Two students can sit in the same lecture hall and pay wildly different amounts based largely on what the university believes each family is willing and able to pay. Madison texts her roommate-to-be to compare offers, and, sure enough, the numbers don't match. Different family income, different aid package, different final price, same dorm room waiting for both of them. Economists call this general strategy price discrimination, and Madison's aid offer is a fairly textbook example of it. Not generosity, a calculation. That explains why her number is so different from her friends'. It doesn't explain why the sticker price needs to be so high in the first place. So Madison starts digging into that question, and this is where the story stops being about her family and starts being about incentives. A normal business-facing competition usually tries to cut costs to win customers. Universities, especially prestigious non-profit ones, often move the opposite direction. In 1980, economist Howard Bowen studied decades of university finances and proposed what's now called the revenue theory of cost, or Bowen's rule. His argument boiled down to a short list. A university's main goals are excellence and prestige. There's almost no ceiling on how much money could plausibly be spent chasing them, so each institution raises all the money it can, and then spends nearly all of it. Not hoarded, not returned, spent. Some economists since have argued Bowen's pattern explains only part of the story, not the whole thing. Universities juggle plenty of other goals too, from research to community mission to basic financial survival. But for many selective institutions, the underlying incentive Bowen described still shows up clearly. There's rarely a reward for finishing the year with money left over, because for a lot of these schools, prestige is one of the most valuable things they're competing for. And prestige isn't cheap. It's built through research funding, name-brand faculty, new buildings, and smaller class sizes. Spending that often makes a university look better, not worse. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What happens when spending money is the thing that makes an institution look more desirable? Money buys better facilities. Better facilities help recruit stronger faculty. Stronger faculty attract more competitive applicants. More competitive applicants raise the school's profile. A stronger profile attracts more donations. And those donations become more money to spend. Frugality doesn't show up on a scoreboard. Spending does. And there is, literally, a scoreboard. Madison finds it while comparing her two offers online: US News and World Report's college rankings. One factor in that formula, called financial resources, measures how much a university spends per student on instruction, research, and student services, and scores higher spending better, almost regardless of how efficiently the money is used. For years, that single factor was worth roughly 10% of a school's entire ranking. US News has since trimmed it down to about 8%, partly in response to criticism that it rewarded spending over affordability. But for a long stretch, and still today to a meaningful degree, a school trying to tighten its budget wasn't just managing its finances, it was risking its rank. Now, add one more piece. Even with prices this high, students keep enrolling because almost nobody has to hand over the full amount up front. Roughly half of bachelor's degree graduates leave school with student debt, averaging somewhere around $30,000. Loans don't single-handedly explain rising tuition. State funding, administrative costs, and demand for selective schools all play a role too. But loans do something subtle to ordinary market pressure. They separate the decision to enroll from the immediate pain of paying. In most purchases, price acts like a brake. Too expensive, and people simply don't buy. A student isn't really asking, "Can I afford this today?" They're asking, "Can I imagine paying this off eventually?" That's a much easier question to say yes to, and it loosens some of the pressure that would otherwise push prices back down. Put these pieces next to each other, and Madison starts to see the actual shape of the system. The sticker price is set high on purpose, then discounted selectively. Spending is rewarded rather than punished, both by prestige seeking and, for years, by the rankings themselves. And financing quietly reduces the resistance that would normally cap what a school can charge. Economists have a term for products where a higher price doesn't scare buyers off because the high price is part of what makes the product desirable in the first place. A Veblen Good. Designer handbags behave this way. So do certain watches. Lower the price on a Veblen Good, and you don't just lose margin. You can make the product look worse, because part of what people were buying was exclusivity, signaled by the number on the tag. Universities aren't purely Veblen goods. They still deliver something real and measurable: instruction, a credential, and for a lot of graduates, a genuine boost in future earnings. But layered on top of that real value is a second, more symbolic product. Here's the idea underneath all of it. A university was never selling just one thing at one price. It's selling a bundle: education, a credential, a network, and a signal of status. And the price tag is partly built around that last piece, not just the first one. That's why two schools can hand a graduate a similar-looking diploma while charging wildly different amounts. Part of what a student is paying for is the exclusivity itself. This is really the deeper question underneath Madison's whole search. Not why is college expensive, but why do people accept such different prices for what looks like the same credential? And the honest answer runs through more than classroom quality. It runs through scarcity. A limited number of seats makes the label harder to get, and harder to get tends to look more valuable. It runs through alumni networks that open doors quietly for decades, long after graduation. And it runs through how employers, rightly or wrongly, read a name on a resume as a shortcut for judging a stranger they've never met. None of that shows up in a classroom. All of it shows up in the price. So, Madison stops asking which school sounds more impressive and starts asking a sharper question. What will I actually pay, and what do I actually get back? She compares net price, not sticker price, on both offers side by side. She checks graduation rates, average debt at graduation, and reported earnings for her intended major a few years out, instead of leaning on brand name alone. She treats expensive and good as two separate questions, because everything she's just learned says they aren't always the same thing. By her numbers, the $85,000 school wins. Not because it looks fancier, but because its real discounted price comes out lower and its outcomes for her field are stronger. If the numbers had pointed the other way, she'd have picked the cheaper looking school without a second thought. So go back to the question this whole video started with: how can the more expensive school actually be the cheaper one? By now the answer isn't really surprising anymore. The sticker price was never a measure of cost. It was a starting number, built to be discounted for most people and paid in full by a few, shaped as much by prestige, rankings, and financing as by anything happening in a classroom. The mistake was never paying $85,000 for college. The mistake would have been assuming that number told anyone what the education was actually worth.